Good evening. I am Clara Nightwell. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There are leaders whose significance is buried beneath the story of how they passed away. And when that happens, what they actually did, the decisions made under the weight of annihilation can disappear into grief and myth. Tonight, we turn to a president who governed at the precise moment when human civilization acquired the technical capacity to end itself. We ask what it means to hold executive power when the stakes of any single decision are measured not in territory or treasure but in the survival of nations.
The presidency of John F. Kennedy lasted only 1,036 days, yet it coincided with the most dangerous sustained confrontation of the nuclear age, a period in which the architecture of modern executive power was being rebuilt in real time.
We are speaking about John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States, serving from January 1961 until his life ended in November 1963, a leader whose presidency redefined the relationship between executive authority, nuclear strategy, media power, and the meaning of American leadership in a bipolar world.
Then let us begin with the formation and the world that made Kennedy's presidency both possible and necessary.
John Kennedy was born on the 29th of May, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, into one of the most politically ambitious families in American life. His father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, was a financier, a former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was a man who understood power as a project to be constructed across generations. John was the second of 9 children. The family's political ambitions had initially centered on his elder brother Joseph Jr., who passed away during a bombing mission in the Second World War. John inherited both the expectation and the burden. He studied at Harvard, where he completed a thesis that was later published as Why England Slept, an analysis of Britain's failure to rearm in the face of Nazi Germany. It was a serious work for a young man, and it signaled an abiding interest in the mechanics of political failure.
So from the beginning, he was drawn not to triumph, but to the question of why capable institutions collapse.
Exactly. He served in the United States Navy during the Second World War, commanding a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. When his vessel was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer, he led his surviving crew to safety through dangerous waters, an act of physical courage that became central to his public image. He returned from the war with chronic back pain and the early signs of Addison's disease, a condition affecting the adrenal glands that would require ongoing medical management throughout his life. He concealed the severity of his health problems from the public. He entered Congress in 1946, representing a district in Massachusetts. He served in the House of Representatives for 6 years before moving to the Senate in 1952, defeating the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge.
So his ascent through elected office was swift and largely unobstructed.
Yes, but it was not uncontroversial. In the Senate, he was seen as charming but not yet a serious legislative force. His book Profiles in Courage, published in 1955 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize, enhanced his national reputation considerably, though questions about the extent of his direct authorship have followed it ever since. He made an unsuccessful bid for the vice presidential nomination in 1956, which paradoxically served him well. His graceful concession speech was broadcast nationally and introduced him to an audience far beyond Massachusetts. By 1960, he was running for the presidency against the Republican nominee Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president. The race was defined more than any before it by a new medium, television.
So television was not a backdrop to that election. It was the arena.
Exactly. The first televised presidential debate, broadcast in September 1960, became one of the most studied moments in the history of political communication. Kennedy appeared composed, tanned, and at ease before the camera. Nixon appeared pale, perspiring, and visibly uncomfortable. Polling afterward revealed a striking divergence. Those who heard the debate on radio considered Nixon the winner. Those who watched it on television considered Kennedy the winner. The gap between those two responses defined a new era in democratic politics. Kennedy won the election by one of the narrowest popular vote margins in American history, receiving approximately 49.7% of the popular vote against Nixon's 49.5%. The margin was thinner than the myth that surrounded it.
So he entered the most powerful office in the world with almost no mandate in the numerical sense.
Yes, and yet his inaugural address, delivered on the 20th of January 1961, projected a confidence and rhetorical clarity that seemed to transcend the arithmetic of his victory. The address contained a line that would define his public identity. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It was a call to civic obligation framed as moral challenge, and it landed with the force of a founding document. He was 43 years old at his inauguration, the youngest elected president in American history. He was also the first Roman Catholic to hold the office. Both facts carried enormous symbolic weight in a country still navigating the boundaries of who could represent its highest ideals.
So, from the first day, his presence in the office was itself a kind of argument about what America was becoming.
Exactly. But the world he inherited did not pause for symbolism. Kennedy took office at the height of the Cold War, a global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that had already produced the Korean conflict, the Berlin blockade, and the accelerating nuclear arms race. The strategic logic of the Cold War rested on the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to annihilate the other many times over. The stability of this arrangement depended entirely on both sides, believing that any first strike would produce a response that made the attack self-defeating. Kennedy understood this logic deeply. He had studied it. He surrounded himself with advisors drawn from the emerging field of strategic studies. Men like Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Dean Rusk, who approached nuclear deterrence as a problem of rational calculation, rather than moral theology.
So he brought a certain kind of analytical coldness to the management of existential risk.
Yes, but his first major foreign policy action was neither cold nor analytical. It was a disaster. In April 1961, Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, a covert operation planned under the Eisenhower administration to support a brigade of Cuban exiles in overthrowing Fidel Castro's government. The operation failed completely. The exile brigade was captured within days. Kennedy had withheld the air support that military planners had considered essential, unwilling to make direct American military involvement unmistakable. The result was the worst of both options: obvious American fingerprints without American military effectiveness.
So the Bay of Pigs revealed the gap between the confidence of the inaugural address and the complexity of actual executive decision-making.
Exactly. Kennedy accepted public responsibility for the failure. He reportedly told an aide that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan, and then claimed paternity openly. It was a calculated act of accountability that paradoxically improved his standing in opinion polling. More importantly, the failure transformed how he would govern. He became deeply skeptical of military and intelligence advice. He created new structures for deliberation within his administration, insisting that options be examined from multiple angles before decisions were made. In June 1961, he met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. The summit was not productive. Khrushchev, who had assessed Kennedy as young and inexperienced after the Bay of Pigs, pressed him hard on Berlin and on the general balance of power. Kennedy returned from Vienna shaken.
So Khrushchev read the Bay of Pigs as weakness and acted on that reading.
Yes. Within weeks of Vienna, the Soviet Union began construction of the Berlin Wall, sealing off East Berlin and ending the flow of refugees to the west. Kennedy's response was measured rather than confrontational. He reinforced the American commitment to West Berlin without escalating to military action, but the larger test was still approaching. In October 1962, American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction in Cuba. The missiles, once operational, would be capable of reaching most major American cities within minutes. Kennedy convened a secret advisory group that became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For 13 days, this group deliberated on how to respond while the president maintained his public schedule to avoid signaling that a crisis was underway.
So the most dangerous 13 days in the history of the nuclear age were conducted in deliberate concealment from the public.
Exactly. The options presented to Kennedy ranged from a surgical air strike to destroy the missile sites, to a full military invasion of Cuba, to a naval blockade that would prevent further Soviet shipments from reaching the island or even ports. The Joint Chiefs of Staff favored military action. Kennedy was skeptical. He learned from the Bay of Pigs to distrust the confidence of military planners. He also understood that an airstrike could not guarantee the destruction of all missile sites, and that any strike that passed away Soviet personnel would create an obligation on Khrushchev to respond. He chose the blockade, which he called a quarantine, to avoid the legal implications of the term blockade under international law. It was a middle option that applied pressure without closing off the possibility of a negotiated resolution.
So he chose the option that preserved time, the one resource that diplomacy requires.
Yes. On the 22nd of October 1962, he addressed the American public on television, revealing the existence of the missiles and the American response. The world now knew what had been in preparation for nearly 2 weeks. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment were already en route to Cuba. American naval vessels were positioned to intercept them. The moment when those ships would reach the quarantine line was understood by both sides as the point at which the crisis could become a war. The Soviet ships stopped short of the line. Secretary of State Dean Rusk reportedly said, "We are eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." It was a vivid summary, but it obscured the degree to which both sides were looking for a way to step back.
So, the resolution required both leaders to want the same outcome, even if neither could say so publicly.
Exactly. The back-channel negotiations that followed were complex and involved multiple intermediaries. The public resolution included a Soviet commitment to remove the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. The private resolution included an additional American commitment to remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession Kennedy made but kept secret for decades to avoid the appearance of having traded American security assets under Soviet pressure. The Cuban Missile Crisis is now studied in military academies, diplomatic schools, and political science programs across the world as the definitive case study in nuclear crisis management. Kennedy's handling of it established a template for how nuclear-armed states should manage confrontation without triggering catastrophe.
So the crisis produced not just a resolution, but a doctrine.
Yes. In its immediate aftermath, Kennedy and Khrushchev established the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication channel between the two leaders designed to prevent future crises from escalating through miscommunication. Kennedy also shifted his public rhetoric on the Cold War. In his American University commencement address of June 1963, he called for a re-examination of American attitudes toward the Soviet Union, acknowledging Soviet suffering in the Second World War and arguing for a peace that did not require the transformation of the Soviet system as a precondition. That speech contributed directly to the negotiation of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed in August 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. It was the first significant arms control agreement of the nuclear age.
So the missile crisis did not end with a military conclusion. It produced the beginning of arms control.
Exactly. And simultaneously, Kennedy was navigating a domestic transformation that carried its own historic weight. The civil rights movement in the United States had been building for years before Kennedy's presidency. The Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-in campaigns, the freedom rides, all preceded him. Kennedy entered office cautious on civil rights, fearful of alienating the Southern Democratic bloc he needed to govern. His early record was mixed. He appointed federal judges in the South who were hostile to desegregation. He delayed executive action on civil rights, issues he had promised to address by the stroke of a pen during his campaign.
So the gap between his rhetoric and his early action was visible to those who were watching most closely.
Yes, but events moved faster than his caution. In 1962, the enrollment of James Meredith as the first black student at the University of Mississippi provoked violent riots that required the deployment of federal marshals and ultimately federal troops. Kennedy was forced to act. In 1963, the televised images of civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, being met with fire hoses and police dogs produced a moral shock across the country and internationally. Kennedy understood that the United States could not credibly claim to lead the free world while its own citizens were treated in this manner. On the 11th of June 1963, Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address, framing civil rights explicitly as a moral issue, not merely a political or legal one. He announced his intention to send comprehensive civil rights legislation to Congress.
So the Cold War framing of American credibility became in the end one of the arguments that moved him toward action.
Exactly. He could not ask the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia to align with the United States while American television broadcast images of racial violence against black American citizens. The foreign policy argument and the moral argument converged. The legislation Kennedy proposed would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed after his passing under President Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy did not live to sign it, but the legislative momentum was his. The third great domain of Kennedy's presidency was the space race. In May 1961, weeks after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The Soviet Union had already launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, in April 1961. The United States was trailing in what the world read as a competition between two models of civilization.
So the moon was not a scientific destination. It was a geopolitical statement.
Yes. Kennedy said so with unusual directness in his address to Rice University in September 1962. He acknowledged that the goal was difficult and expensive, but argued that the United States chose to go to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard, framing technological ambition as a form of national character. The Apollo program that his commitment initiated would employ at its peak over 400,000 people, and consume roughly 4% of the federal budget annually. It was one of the largest peacetime mobilizations of human and technical resources in history. Kennedy did not live to see the fulfillment of his commitment. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in July 1969, nearly 6 years after Kennedy's life ended. But the political decision and the institutional architecture that made it possible was Kennedy's.
So, he set in motion something whose conclusion he could not witness.
Exactly. And that pattern of decisions whose consequences extended far beyond his presidency is central to understanding why Kennedy matters beyond the story of his end. On the 22nd of November 1963, Kennedy was traveling in a presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, when he was struck by gunfire and his life ended. He was 46 years. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the attack. Oswald's life was ended 2 days later by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. The Warren Commission, appointed by President Johnson, concluded that Oswald had acted alone. That conclusion has been disputed, defended, and re-examined ever since.
So the circumstances of his end became, for many, more consuming than the substance of his governance.
Yes, and that displacement is itself historically significant. The television broadcast of his funeral reached an audience of 180 million Americans, nearly the entire population of the United States at the time. The collective grief was real, and it was enormous. But grief, when it becomes the primary lens through which a leader is remembered, tends to flatten the actual record into sentiment. Kennedy's historical significance lies not in his passing, but in what he actually did while alive.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Kennedy actually governed, beyond the myth and the tragedy, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Kennedy by Ted Sorensen.
So this is a book written by someone who was inside the decision-making process itself.
Precisely. Sorensen served as Kennedy's chief speechwriter and one of his closest advisors. His book focuses not on the personal mythology, but on governance, decision-making, and Cold War strategy, examining how Kennedy navigated nuclear brinkmanship, civil rights pressures, and executive authority. It situates Kennedy's leadership within the structural tensions of the Cold War, rather than reducing his significance to the circumstances of his passing.
Is it accessible to someone coming to Kennedy's presidency for the first time?
It is detailed and thorough, which means it rewards a patient reader. Sorensen writes with precision and institutional knowledge that no outside historian can fully replicate. A reader should be aware that it is an insider account, written with admiration. But that proximity is also what makes it irreplaceable for understanding how decisions were actually made.
So reading it gives you access to the texture of governance, not just its outcomes.
That is exactly right. For anyone who wants to understand what it felt like to make decisions at the edge of catastrophe, there is no closer account available.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Kennedy's presidency operates on several distinct levels, and they must be examined separately to be understood clearly. The first level is the institutional. Kennedy transformed the internal architecture of executive decision-making. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that the formal chain of command, the Joint Chiefs, the Cabinet, the established protocols, was insufficient for managing a nuclear confrontation. The Executive Committee he convened operated outside normal institutional channels. bringing together advisors from different departments in a deliberate, iterative process of option analysis. That model became the template for subsequent administrations managing foreign policy crises.
So, the crisis produced a new model of how presidents manage information under pressure.
Exactly. The second level is strategic. Kennedy's handling of the missile crisis established principles that shaped American nuclear policy for decades. The preference for graduated response over immediate escalation. The use of economic and diplomatic pressure as alternatives to military action. The importance of leaving adversaries a path to retreat without humiliation. All became doctrinal foundations. The concept of flexible response, which Kennedy's administration developed to replace the Eisenhower doctrine of massive retaliation, argued that the United States should be capable of responding to Soviet aggression at any level of intensity, without immediately reaching for nuclear weapons. It was a doctrine that required a more sophisticated and expensive military establishment, but one that offered more actual options. Kennedy also significantly expanded American Special Operations Forces and counterinsurgency capabilities, anticipating that the Cold War's most active theaters would not be nuclear confrontations in Europe, but irregular conflicts in the developing world.
So he saw that the real competition would happen at the margins of the bipolar order, not at its center.
Yes, again was one of those margins. Kennedy escalated American military involvement in South Vietnam, increasing the number of military advisors from roughly 900 to over 16,000 by the time of his passing. Whether he would have further escalated or found a way to withdraw remains one of the genuinely unresolvable historical questions. What is not in dispute is that the framework he built, the advisors, the counterinsurgency doctrine, the commitment to South Vietnam's survival, was the framework within which his successors made their decisions.
So even his unfinished policies left structures that others would inhabit.
Exactly. The third level of legacy is cultural and communicative. Kennedy's use of television was not merely a personal skill. It transformed the relationship between the presidency and the public in ways that could not be reversed. He held 64 press conferences, most of them broadcast live on television. He was comfortable, witty, and precise under questioning in a way that no previous president had been before a camera. He made intellectual engagement with the press a feature of the office rather than a liability. The White House under Kennedy became a cultural center in a way it had not been before. His wife Jacqueline oversaw a restoration of the executive mansion and cultivated an image of aesthetic seriousness that the press called Camelot, borrowing from the Broadway musical then running in New York.
So the presidency became, under Kennedy, a vehicle for a particular idea of American civilization.
Yes, and that image proved more durable than the man. Every subsequent American president has had to negotiate with the Kennedy comparison, either by embracing it, rejecting it, or being measured against it. Historians have, over decades, produced a more complicated portrait. The personal conduct revealed after his passing, the health problems concealed from the public, the extent of intelligence operations authorized against foreign leaders, the early slowness on civil rights. These complicate the image without erasing the substance. What remains when the mythology is set aside is a presidency of genuine consequence. The missile crisis alone would secure Kennedy's place in the history of the nuclear age. The Arms Control Treaty, the civil rights legislation he initiated, the space program he committed, together constitute a record that does not require embellishment.
So the actual record, stripped of the myth, is already significant.
Exactly. Perhaps the deepest legacy of Kennedy's presidency is the question it posed and never fully answered. Can a democracy governed by elected leaders, constrained by public opinion, legislative opposition, and the pressures of media coverage, manage the kind of slow, disciplined, long-term thinking that nuclear strategies requires? Kennedy's 13 days in October 1962 suggested that the answer was yes, under the right conditions, with the right leadership, and with a measure of good fortune that should not be overlooked. Documents declassified in subsequent decades have revealed how close the confrontation came to catastrophe. A Soviet submarine, cut off from communication and believing war might already have begun, came within a single officer's decision of launching a nuclear torpedo at American naval vessels. That officer, Vasily Arkhipov, declined to authorize the launch.
So the survival of civilization in October 1962 depended in part on the judgment of a man whose name was unknown to the world for decades.
Yes. That is the dimension of the crisis that no presidential decision-making model can fully account for. Kennedy managed brilliantly what was within his control. What lay outside his control was managed, on at least one occasion, by someone neither he nor Khrushchev had ever heard of. Kennedy left office in the sense that matters to history, not through an election or a term's end, but through an act of violence that transformed him immediately into a symbol. The symbol has been both useful and distorting.
So the manner of his passing became a kind of permanent interference in how he is remembered.
Exactly. And the task of historical recovery is to look past that interference at the decisions made, the structures built, and the questions posed by a presidency that lasted less than 3 years but reshaped the terms on which American power would be exercised for generations.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the decisions, the crises, and the structural transformations of a presidency that governed at the edge of annihilation.
Kennedy did not save the world by himself, but he created the conditions in which it could be saved, and that is the kind of leadership that history most needs to understand.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.